In the small town of Willow Creek, nothing much ever happened. It was a quiet place where people went about their lives in predictable routines. But behind the neat rows of houses and the picturesque main street, secrets were brewing, secrets that would soon tear the town apart. Megan Wallace, a 32-year-old high school English teacher, was admired and respected by everyone in town. She had been teaching at Willow Creek High for nearly 10 years and was known for her dedication and passion for her students. With her striking red hair, friendly smile, and keen intellect, she was the kind of teacher students remembered fondly long after they graduated. Megan's personal life, however, was far from the image she portrayed. Her marriage to Tom, a local businessman, was crumbling. The couple had grown distant over the years, their conversations reduced to obligatory small talk about bills and household chores. The once vibrant connection between them had faded, replaced by a cold, aching silence that filled their home. Enter Jack Turner, the school's janitor. At 45, Jack was a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. He had a rugged appearance, with his weathered face and tired eyes that spoke of a hard life. Jack was an outsider in Willow Creek, having moved there only 2 years ago after the sudden death of his wife. The townsfolk saw him as polite but reserved, always working diligently to keep the school in pristine condition. It was a rainy afternoon in October when their paths crossed in a way that would change everything. Megan was staying late to grade papers, the school empty except for Jack, who was mopping the hallway outside her classroom. As she stepped out to stretch her legs, their eyes met for the first time. There was a spark, an unspoken connection that neither could explain. Over the next few weeks, Megan and Jack began to talk. It started innocently enough. Small conversations about the weather, the challenges of their jobs, and their mutual love for classic literature. Megan found Jack to be surprisingly well-read, and their conversations soon delved deeper, touching on topics that she couldn't discuss with anyone else. He was a listener, something she desperately needed. As the days turned into weeks, their interactions grew more frequent, and their bond deepened. Megan felt alive again, something she hadn't felt in years. Jack, too, found solace in their conversations, a brief respite from his grief and loneliness. There was a magnetic pull between them, one that they both tried to resist, but found impossible to ignore. Then, one evening, as they stood in the dimly lit hallway, their conversation took a turn. Megan had been crying, frustrated with her failing marriage and the monotony of her life. Jack, wanting to comfort her, gently placed his hand on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it ignited something in both of them. Before they knew it, they were kissing, a desperate, passionate kiss that neither of them could have foreseen. That kiss marked the beginning of their affair. They met in secret, careful to keep their relationship hidden from the prying eyes of the small-town gossip mill. They would steal moments in the darkened classrooms after school, share lingering touches in the empty hallways, and exchange heated text messages late at night. The risk of being caught only heightened the excitement, making every stolen moment more intoxicating. But as the affair continued, it became clear that their relationship was not just a fleeting infatuation. Megan was falling in love with Jack, and he with her. The intensity of their emotions scared them both, but they were too far gone to turn back. Then, just as they thought they had their secret under control, a rumor began to spread. One of the students, a troubled boy named Kyle, had seen them together. He had noticed the way Megan and Jack looked at each other, the way they lingered too long in each other's presence. He didn't have proof, but his suspicions were enough to start a wildfire of whispers and speculation among the students. Megan and Jack were oblivious to the growing rumors, caught up in their own world. But it wasn't long before their secret began to unravel. Tom, Megan's husband, had noticed her growing distance and the late nights at school. He had tried to ignore it at first, blaming it on stress and her dedication to teaching. But as the rumors reached his ears, suspicion turned into certainty. One evening, Tom confronted Megan. His voice was filled with hurt and anger as he accused her of having an affair. Megan, caught off guard, tried to deny it, but the guilt and shame were written all over her face. She knew the truth was out. Desperate to salvage what was left of their marriage, Megan promised to end things with Jack. She knew it was the right thing to do, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. Torn between her duty as a wife and her love for Jack, Megan faced an impossible choice. She agreed to meet Jack one last time, to say goodbye. They met in an abandoned classroom after school, the weight of their decision hanging heavy in the air. As they stood there, tears streaming down Megan's face, Jack tried to convince her to leave with him, to start a new life together away from Willow Creek, but Megan knew she couldn't do it. The guilt, the fear of what the affair had already done to her marriage and reputation, was too much. She kissed him one last time, a kiss filled with sorrow and regret, and then walked away, leaving Jack standing alone in the darkened classroom. What neither of them knew was that this decision would set off a chain of events that would lead to unimaginable tragedy. For in the shadows, someone had been watching, and the secrets they thought they had hidden so well were about to be exposed in the most horrifying way imaginable. Megan thought that ending the affair would put an end to the turmoil in her life, but the opposite happened. Tom's anger had only grown after their confrontation. He became cold, distant, and his behavior started to border on obsessive. He would stay up late, scrolling through Megan's phone, checking her messages, trying to find any sign that she was still in contact with Jack. Meanwhile, Jack was struggling to let go. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Megan and began sending her desperate texts and emails, pleading for another chance. Megan ignored them, terrified that Tom would find out and that her life would completely fall apart. But despite her attempts to cut ties, she couldn't stop thinking about Jack. The connection they had was too strong to simply forget. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late November, and the town was wrapped in a chilly darkness. Megan was home alone, grading papers at the kitchen table. Tom was out, supposedly at a business meeting, but Megan knew better. He had been avoiding her, staying out late, nursing his own wounds. The loud knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially at this hour. Hesitantly, she walked to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Jack. Panic surged through her. She hadn't seen him in weeks, not since that painful goodbye. She knew she shouldn't open the door, but the desperation in his eyes was unmistakable. Against her better judgment, she unlocked the door and let him in. Jack stepped inside, his face pale and haggard. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Megan, I'm sorry for showing up like this, but I needed to see you," he said, his voice trembling. "Jack, you shouldn't be here. If Tom finds out," Megan began, but Jack cut her off. "I can't let you go, Megan. I can't. We were happy. We can be happy again," he pleaded, stepping closer to her. His eyes were wild, and Megan felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. "Jack, it's over. We can't keep doing this. Please, just go before Tom gets home," she insisted, her voice shaking, but Jack wasn't listening. He reached out and grabbed her arm. "You don't love him, Megan. You love me. I know you do," he said, his grip tightening. Megan tried to pull away, panic rising in her chest. "Let go of me, Jack. You're scaring me," she said, her voice cracking with fear. Suddenly, the front door swung open. Tom stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice a dangerous growl. Megan's heart sank. She knew there was no way to explain this, no way to make Tom believe that she hadn't invited Jack here. "Tom, it's not what it looks like," she stammered, but Tom was already advancing towards Jack, his fists clenched. "What are you doing in my house?" Tom shouted, his face contorted with rage. Jack let go of Megan and turned to face him, his own anger flaring up. "We need to talk," Jack said, his voice steady now, but there was an edge to it that made Megan's blood run cold. "About Megan. About everything." "There's nothing to talk about, you bastard," Tom spat, and in a flash, he lunged at Jack, shoving him against the wall. The two men grappled, fists flying, and Megan screamed, begging them to stop, but they were beyond listening. Tom's rage and Jack's desperation clashed violently, and as they struggled, the tension that had been simmering for weeks exploded into raw, physical fury. Megan tried to pull them apart, but they were too strong, too consumed by their own anger. Then, in the chaos, it happened. Tom pushed Jack away, sending him stumbling into the kitchen. Jack grabbed onto the counter to steady himself, his hand closing around a large kitchen knife that Megan had left out after dinner. He turned back to Tom, the knife gleaming in his hand, his eyes dark with fury. "Stay away from her," Jack shouted, brandishing the knife in front of him. Tom hesitated, the sight of the weapon causing him to pause for a moment. But it was only a moment. "You're insane," Tom yelled, and with a roar, he lunged at Jack again, his anger blinding him to the danger. Jack swung the knife wildly, and for a terrifying second, everything seemed to slow down. Megan watched in horror as the blade sliced through the air, catching Tom in the side. Tom staggered back, a look of shock and pain crossing his face. He looked down at the blood spreading across his shirt, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You stabbed me," he whispered, almost as if he couldn't believe it himself. Jack's face went pale as he realized what he had done. "Tom, I didn't mean to," he stammered, but it was too late. Tom's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as blood pooled around him. Megan screamed, dropping to her knees beside her husband, her hands shaking as she tried to press down on the wound. "Tom, stay with me. Please stay with me," she sobbed, but the blood wouldn't stop. It was everywhere, soaking through her clothes, staining her hands. Jack stood frozen, the knife still in his hand, his face twisted in horror. "Megan, I didn't mean to do this. I didn't mean to hurt him," he said, his voice a broken whisper. Megan looked up at him, her eyes filled with terror and disbelief. "Get out, Jack. Get out," she screamed, her voice breaking. Jack backed away, his hands shaking, and then he turned and ran, the door slamming shut behind him. Megan was left alone with her dying husband, her heart breaking as she held him in her arms, whispering words of love and regret. But it was no use. The life drained from Tom's eyes, and with a final, shuddering breath, he was gone. Megan knelt beside her husband's lifeless body, her mind reeling with shock and horror. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, was dead, and the man she had risked everything for had killed him. She knew she had to call 911, but her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely dial the number. As she waited for the emergency services, her eyes darted around the room, taking in the blood-splattered walls and the discarded knife. The reality of what had happened crashed down on her like a wave, and she let out a choked sob, unable to comprehend the nightmare that her life had become. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air, and paramedics rushed into the house, followed by police officers. Megan was pulled away from Tom's body as they tried to revive him, but it was no use. He was gone. As the paramedics declared Tom dead, the police began their investigation. They questioned Megan, who was barely coherent, her words a jumbled mess of apologies and confusion. All she could say was that it was an accident, that Jack hadn't meant to kill him. But the officers' eyes were hard, and she knew they didn't believe her. Just as they were about to take her to the station for further questioning, another officer burst into the house. "We've got him," he said, his voice tense. "Jack Turner. He's down at the old storage shed behind the school. We need to get over there now." The police rushed to the storage shed, where they found Jack, sitting on the floor, the bloody knife still clutched in his hand. His face was pale and blank, his eyes staring vacantly at the concrete wall. When they shouted at him to drop the knife, he didn't respond, as if he couldn't even hear them. It wasn't until one of the officers cautiously approached him and reached out that Jack seemed to come back to reality. He blinked, looked down at the knife in his hand, and then slowly set it down on the floor, his entire body trembling. "I didn't mean to do it," he whispered, his voice hollow and broken. "I just wanted to talk to her. I didn't mean to hurt him." The officers moved in, cuffing Jack's hands behind his back and leading him out of the shed. He didn't resist, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The entire town of Willow Creek was in shock as news of the murder spread. People couldn't believe that the quiet janitor and the beloved teacher had been involved in such a tragic and violent incident. The school was shut down for days as police combed through the scene, trying to piece together what had led to that deadly night back at the police station. Megan was beside herself with grief and guilt. She was questioned for hours, every detail of her affair with Jack laid bare. She told them everything, how it had started, how it had spiraled out of control, and how she had tried to end it. She admitted to letting Jack into the house that night, but she insisted that she never thought it would end like this. Her words were met with skepticism, but the police had bigger concerns. Jack was charged with second-degree murder, and his trial became the talk of the town. In court, He sat silently, his eyes downcast, as the prosecutor painted him as a man consumed by obsession, a man who had killed in a fit of jealous rage. The defense tried to argue that it was a tragic accident, a moment of panic that had turned deadly. They portrayed Jack as a broken man, devastated by the loss of his wife and desperate for a connection, but it wasn't enough. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Jack was sentenced to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12. As he was led away, he glanced at Megan, his eyes filled with sorrow and regret. Megan watched him go, her heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and grief. She knew that she would never forgive herself for what had happened, that the love they had shared had destroyed everything she had once held dear. In the aftermath, Megan's life fell apart. She left Willow Creek, unable to face the judgmental stares and whispered accusations. She moved to a small town far away, where no one knew her name or her story. But the past haunted her, the memory of that bloody night forever etched in her mind. She could never escape it, no matter how far she ran. The town of Willow Creek slowly returned to its quiet routine, but the memory of what had happened lingered, a dark stain on its peaceful facade. The school reopened, the classrooms filled with new faces, but the story of the teacher and the janitor, and the murder that had shocked them all, was never forgotten. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how passion and secrecy could turn deadly in the blink of an eye. And Megan, wherever she was, carried the weight of that night with her, a constant reminder of the price she had paid for love.